The Associated Press has some new information about Donald Trump's visit this past week to Arlington National Cemetery, the controversial visit when Donald Trump not only laid a wreath at the Tomb of the Unknowns, but then posed for a photo op with some of the family members of soldiers who were killed in that Afghanistan withdrawal attack 3 years ago. According to the Associated Press, the Trump campaign was warned in advance not to take pictures or photographs. And this came again before Donald Trump and his entourage arrived at Section 60, which is the part of Arlington National Cemetery where the freshest graves are, the dead from Iraq and Afghanistan. And this was also apparently, he was given the warning before the alleged altercation. There are allegations that some of Donald Trump's staff were told by a cemetery official, hey, you can't take pictures, you can't go here and make this a political photo op. And they allegedly shoved this Army official and continued on. And the Army is defending the cemetery workers, saying that the effort was appropriate. And they're reminding everybody that it is against the law to do politicking, to do political events at Arlington National Cemetery. Well, Donald Trump is doubling down, saying he has no regrets. And he's saying that this is a made-up controversy by the media.
And while I was there, those families that asked me to be there, as they said, 3 families plus 1 soldier who was horrifically injured, both legs and an arm. And they asked me if I would be there, so I went. And while we were there, they said, could you take pictures over the grave of my son, my sister, my brother? Would you take pictures with us, sir? I said, absolutely, I did. And then I said farewell. I said goodbye. And last night I read that I was using the site to politic, that I used it to politic. This all comes out of Washington, just like all of these prosecutors come out of Washington.
Actually, Donald Trump, you were there to politic, and here's the proof. Last year, there was another ceremony marking the 13 Americans who were killed in Afghanistan during the withdrawal 3 years ago. Donald Trump did not attend. The year before, there was another ceremony at Arlington for the families of the 13 soldiers who were killed during withdrawal. Donald Trump did not attend that. So what's different this year? Oh, yeah. We're less than 70 days until the presidential election, and Donald Trump is trying to make an appeal to veterans and to the military. And so he goes to Arlington Cemetery. He lays the wreath at the Tomb of the Unknowns, which is fine. And by the way, that was arranged by House Speaker Mike Johnson. And then Donald Trump is invited by some of the family members to go to the graves of those soldiers who were killed. And Donald Trump went and wanted to have his photographer come along with them. And the Arlington National Cemetery said, no, you can't do that. It's against protocol. This is hallowed ground. And Donald Trump's campaign pushes them and uses force to get Donald Trump there and to get the entourage there. I suppose we shouldn't be surprised that Donald Trump and his followers would use force to trample on a government property. After all, we're just a few years past January 6th. The difference this time, of course, is that Donald Trump actually joined his followers in violating the rules and trampling over hallowed grounds by going and not just obviously taking the picture, but there was Donald Trump with the thumbs up at the graves. Now, the family members said Donald Trump acted appropriate and the family members wanted to have a lasting memory, and that's fine. But, you know, there are a lot of people, 400,000 soldiers that are buried at Arlington Cemetery, and there are a lot of people buried in Section 60 who were captured, whose tombstones were captured in some of the photographs in the video. And those families did not give permission for Donald Trump to take photographs or do what he did. So this is, I think this is horrific on so many levels. And for J.D. Vance, Donald Trump's running mate, he is now blaming the controversy on the Democrats and specifically on Vice President Kamala Harris. Watch this.
Kamala Harris is disgraceful. We're going to talk about a story out of those 13 brave, innocent Americans who lost their lives. It's that Kamala Harris is so asleep at the wheel that she won't even do an investigation into what happened, and she wants to yell at Donald Trump because he showed up. She can go to hell.
She can go to hell. A couple of things here. First of all, for J.D. Vance, for anybody to use that sort of expletive against the sitting vice president of the United States, she can go to hell. That's beyond the pale. But secondly, the argument that J.D. Vance is making is that, well, this is President Biden and Kamala Harris's fault because of the withdrawal was chaotic and not well organized, and therefore a suicide bomber was allowed to somehow get in and kill 200 civilians and 13 U.S. soldiers, and that's Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's fault. The problem with that argument is that if you actually go back to the bombing itself, the bombing was carried out by a member of the Taliban, who had been released from jail by the Afghan government because of a deal that Donald Trump struck with the Taliban, a deal that the Taliban wanted and the Afghan government did not. Essentially, Donald Trump undercut the Afghan government and said, no, you have to accept this deal, which includes releasing, the Afghan government must release 5,000 Taliban soldiers and assassins and criminals. And so the Afghan government did that under the deal arranged by Donald Trump. And then one of those Afghan criminals becomes a suicide bomber and bombs the air base on the withdrawal, killing 200 civilians and 13 soldiers. Was Donald Trump responsible for the bombing? He sure was. Now, he doesn't share the entire blame. And the Biden-Harris administration, sure, they deserve some criticism for the chaotic nature of the withdrawal. But to suggest that this is all on Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, that is flat wrong. And it flies in the face of history and basic facts. And even Donald Trump's own national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, said it was a catastrophic mistake for Donald Trump to negotiate with the Taliban, to create some sort of deal with them, to force the Afghan government to cede power to the Taliban, to force the Afghan government to release these hoodlums from jail who became suicide bombers. McMaster said Donald Trump should have just withdrawn. And by the way, Donald Trump did not withdraw during his term. It came, of course, then during the Biden administration. But by the time the Biden administration chose to make the withdrawal, they had fewer troops to provide security because Donald Trump had ignored his generals who said, no, you need to have 5,000 troops to keep security for this withdrawal to be effective. And Donald Trump said, nope, we're cutting it to 2,500. So by the time that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris said, okay, we're going to have this withdrawal, they didn't have the security measures in place to do an orderly and chaotic-free withdrawal. And we had carnage. So again, my point is that this is not all on the Biden-Harris administration. And anybody who actually reads the history of the bombing of the Kabul airport will see that Donald Trump bears some responsibility. And so now back to Arlington National Cemetery. Again, I get the effort by Donald Trump to try to appeal to veterans. I think this is blowing up in Donald Trump's face. Veterans, by and large, from what I've seen, are more energized and angry over what Donald Trump did at Arlington National Cemetery than anything I've seen the veterans organization speak out on in several years. And a little bit about Arlington National Cemetery. We talked about being hallowed grounds. Here's a little bit of sort of historical fact about it. It obviously wasn't always hallowed grounds. In the 1850s and early 1860s, before the Civil War, there was this hill overlooking Washington, D.C. in Arlington, Virginia, and it was owned by Robert E. Lee. There had been a mansion that had been built there originally for George Washington. Washington never saw it because he died before the mansion was built. The mansion was passed along to one of Washington's children and grandchildren, who then married Robert E. Lee. So Robert E. Lee has this house on this hill overlooking Washington, D.C. The Civil War breaks out, and the Union cemeteries in Alexandria, Virginia, get filled. So the Union Army, to essentially stick it to Robert E. Lee, who had become a Confederate general, started burying their war dead on his property, on the hill overlooking Washington, on the estate that belonged to Robert E. Lee. And by the time the Civil War is over, the property is now unusable as anything but a cemetery because of the number of Union soldiers dead who had been buried there. Eventually, Robert E. Lee and the United States worked out an arrangement that went through the Supreme Court, where Robert E. Lee was essentially paid some money for the property. But that's how this thing got started. It wasn't exactly hallowed ground at the beginning of the Civil War. But after soldiers started getting buried there, and after the Civil War, when the United States government officially made this Arlington National Cemetery, then it became a place of reverence, a place of honoring the fallen heroes. And that has only built up over the years as the war dead from the First World War, and then the Second World War, and then the First War in Iraq, Operation Desert Storm, it goes on. And so now you have 400,000 soldiers who are buried there. And the idea that anybody, any politician, intentionally or unintentionally, would use any part of Arlington National Cemetery for politics to improve their political image is sickening. And the idea that somebody would contradict an Arlington National Cemetery staffer who's saying to you and is warning you, no, you can't take photographs here. This is hallowed ground. This violates protocol. This violates the law. And you do it anyway? That's just sick. It's just disgusting. And again, as I pointed out, veterans vote. And I have a feeling that the numbers are going to hurt Donald Trump even more.